In the year 1, where the Eiffel Tower would rise 2,000 years later, there were only trembling reeds, cold mist, and Parisi boats slipping quietly across the water.
By the year 160, wilderness was being pushed back as Roman Lutetia arrived with stone, fire, commerce, and visible ambition. By the year 320, the empire was wavering, yet from this gray landing Paris still clung to life beneath the first roots of a new faith. In the year 508, once Clovis chose Paris, this riverside ceased to be anonymous and began to witness the making of a capital.
By the year 700, monastery bells rolled through the mist, the riverside fields stirred softly, and the young city seemed to breathe as if guarding its own soul.
In the year 845, Viking warships tore open the river, turning this once quiet view into a gateway of smokesil and dread. By the year 987, the Capetian rise had given this riverside the bearing of a growing center of power.
In the year 1000, Paris entered a new millennium with wooden bridges, crowded cargo boats, and bells that seemed to restart history itself.
By the year 1030, fishers, merchants, and clergy crossed this landing every morning until the old emptiness had nowhere left to stand. By the year 1060, from this unmoving view, Paris was tightening into order beneath guards, taxes, and the discipline of royal power.
By the year 1090, pilgrims and scholars were changing the air itself, as if Paris had begun to awaken through learning.
By the year 1120, the riverbanks smelled of wet wool, salt, charcoal, and leather, proof that Paris had become more than an ordinary port. By the year 1150, schools had begun to rise, argument filled the air, and from this same bank Paris seemed to brighten with ideas.
By the year 1175, the first stones of faith were climbing into the skyline, while the blows of hammers split the Parisian air.
By the year 1200, the walls, paved ways, and discipline of Philip Augustus had forced the city into a harder shape, solid as stone.
By the year 1225, merchants pressed against students, pack horses cut through clergy, and Paris moved like a city packed to the edge.
By the year 1250, under St. Louis, this same view had grown solemn, as if Paris were learning to wear the face of a symbol.
By the year 1280, stone houses, stacked warehouses, and endless freight had made Paris too large to turn back.
By the year 1305, processions of power crossed beneath banners and heavy cloaks, leaving the whole air burdened with grandeur. By the year 1330, markets, river traffic, and craftwork made Paris look untouchable, just before disaster raised its hand.
By the year 1350, plague and war had clawed through the city, leaving only thin footsteps, shuttered doors, and fear hanging in the mist.
By the year 1380, the walls had grown thicker, the faces thinner, and this riverside lived on caution more than hope.
By the year 1410, civil war had begun to tear Paris from within, until even the wind seemed to carry suspicion. By the year 1430, occupation had lowered a cold shadow over the city, and every movement within this frame seemed to shrink beneath it.
By the year 1455, goods had returned to the river, but Paris still walked like a body recovering from old wounds.
By the year 1480, workshops were glowing again, craft streets were waking, and Paris was stitching torn lives back together. By the year 1510, the breath of the Renaissance had slipped across the rooftops, making this old view feel sharper, more elegant, and more ambitious. By the year 1540, art, palaces, and ceremony were rising higher, while the gap between wealth and want grew plain beneath them.
By the year 1570, Paris was holding its breath in religious division, until even the morning market seemed haunted by what was coming.
By the year 1600, Henry IV had drawn the city back toward order, and this riverside was living by construction instead of fear. By the year 1630, noble carriages rolled past guards and merchants, exposing a Paris where power walked in plain sight. By the year 1660, the city was brighter, richer, and more polished, though beneath the shine lay the cost of empire.
By the year 1690, hunger and war had lowered the sky over Paris, and even the movement at the river felt like effort. By the year 1720, coffeehouses, pamphlets, and debate had lit this same scene with a spark of new ideas. By the year 1750, Paris displayed fashion and polish with confidence, while beneath the surface the crowds were packed almost breathless.
By the year 1770, the city still glittered, but something in the air was heating toward an explosion. Then, in the year 1789, Paris ignited in revolution, and the crowd stormed through this frame like a wave too large to stop.
By the year 1801, the city had scarcely caught its breath before the Napoleonic age marched in with steel-cold rhythm. By the year 1810, empire stood at its height, and from this riverside Paris looked like the capital of a continent. By the year 1820, the guns had faded, shops and carriages had returned, but the city still wore the face of exhaustion. In the year 1830, the July Revolution erupted, and this familiar street of movement became a battle line within hours.
By the year 1840, coal smoke had darkened the sky, announcing an age of labor, speed, and buried anger.
In the year 1848, barricades sprang up in ordinary daylight, turning this fixed view into an open challenge to power.
By the year 1855, world exhibitions, machinery, and foreign crowds had pushed Paris toward the role of modern capital.
By the year 1865, Haussmann had cut straight avenues through the body of the city, making Paris grander and easier to control.
By the year 1875, after war and commune, this same frame carried the look of recovery, with the heat of ashes still beneath it. By the year 1880, Champ de Mars was becoming a national stage, as if Paris itself were drawing breath before greeting the world.
Then, in the year 1889, the Eiffel Tower shot into the sky and split the old horizon forever. By the year 1895, beneath that giant iron skeleton, tourists, electric light, and commerce made Paris look like a dream with tickets.
By the year 1905, entering a new century, Paris was brighter, faster, and more certain that no one could stop its lead. In the year 1914, World War tightened around Paris, and the space beneath the Eiffel Tower seemed to hold its breath.
By the year 1924, after the wreckage, Paris rose again in jazz, nightlights, and a hunger to live. By the year 1934, crisis and political extremity had thrown a shadow over every movement, and even elegance showed cracks. In the year 1944, liberation flooded the frame with flags, tears, and cheering, as if the city itself were crying out.
By the year 1954, post-war Paris was rebuilding itself with cars, signs, and consumer light, while older pains slipped backward into memory. By the year 1964, the crowds were thicker, the traffic denser, and the Eiffel Tower belonged not just to Paris, but to the world. By the year 1974, Paris was pulling against itself, trying to preserve an old soul while opening its gates to the future. By the year 1984, television, floodlights, and popular culture had turned this view into a living postcard recognized everywhere. By the year 1994, globalization was pouring into every cafe, every tour group, every sign, and every pace of the city. In the year 2000, Millennium Light washed over the Eiffel Tower, and the whole frame seemed to witness a door opening into a new age.
By the year 2001, the new century had opened, with tourism, control, and a sharper edge of security.
By the year 2004, international crowds had filled the scene, proving that this city had become a dream millions wanted to step into.
By the year 2007, cameras, phones, and a glowing night had turned every moment beneath the tower into an instant symbol.
By the year 2010, Paris was no longer just being seen, it was being broadcast to the world in real time.
By the year 2012, even as Europe shook economically, Paris still held its rhythm through tourism, service, and an almost irreplaceable pull.
In the year 2015, after the attacks, Paris hurt deeply but did not bow, and the lights beneath the tower burned on like a vow.
By the year 2018, protests were pushing through the beauty, making Paris look at once magnificent, tense, and uncertain.
In the year 2020, the pandemic emptied this iconic frame until the silence itself felt unnatural. By the year 2023, the crowds and laughter had returned, but something in the city's gaze was still carrying an unfinished memory.
In the year 2026, from this one fixed view, Paris stands like a living sediment of time, where 2,000 years have never truly gone away.